Hello, everybody. It's good to see y'all again. Today, I am taking y'all through Block 3, which is basically the foreign and domestic policies during the era of good feelings. So, last class, we learned about the effects of the War of 1812 and how after the War of 1812, we definitely saw a big rise of nationalism. We saw this in the economy with Henry Clay's American system, definitely seeing the economy grow, especially the industrialization of the economy. We also saw this just in the American spirit, like the fact that people are identifying as American, having more of that pride in being an American. And we also saw this happening politically, the fact that the era of good feelings was this short time where, for the most part, there was very little political opposition. For the most part, Americans kind of saw themselves as one party, very little division, very little discord. And so we definitely see in the era of good feelings, political, economic, and social movements in nationalism in this effect of the War of 1812. So today I'm going to continue talking about the era of good feelings and how through the era of good feelings, we are going to have some substantial domestic and foreign policies. And we'll also see how the era of good feelings starts to come to an end because it doesn't last long. It was a very short period where we actually had this unified country that for the most part got along with very little division. And unfortunately, it doesn't last forever. And so, with that, we're going to go through the domestic issues first and then the foreign policies that the U.S. Establishes after the War of 1812. So, to take us through the domestic policies first, we are going to talk about the West. After the War of 1812, we saw how, as the Americans were expanding into the Louisiana Purchase, into this big territory, there were tensions with the Native Americans. However, with the War of 1812, while it's still kind of like no one really truly won, without a doubt, the Native Americans lost. Native Americans were pushed further west of the Mississippi River, and that land where you are going to see major development from the United States. So, with moving west, why are people moving west? Well, like I've just talked about, one of the big reasons why people were moving west was because the native threat, for the most part, was pushed out. Because natives were pushed west of the Mississippi, we definitely see in the United States the native land that was once, protected and defended. Now that threat has been pretty much diminished up until the Mississippi River. So because the Native American territory, for the most part, the power has diminished, Americans feel more comfortable with moving into the West without having a fear or a threat of conflict. Another reason people are moving west is primarily because of economics. This is really a big reason why people move west is for opportunity, for economic growth, and for economic gain. And so we definitely see that after the War of 1812, because the War of 1812 really hurt New England's industry and the North's industry, really hurt the trade. We are still recovering the economy. And so we definitely see people moving out west for opportunities. But in the South, there was a big push to move out west for more fertile land. The land in the South, for the most part, is getting pretty dry. It's getting overworked. And so this abundance of territory out west seemed like a good opportunity for Southerners to go and grow, and especially because cotton is starting to become extremely profitable in the U.S. But lastly, we also see major improvements to transportation. So third reason that people are moving out west is really because of transportation is improving. This is actually the national road where we see connections out to west to east to transport goods. Because if you move out west and you can't move your goods to the cities, you're not going to be able to make money. But we definitely see improvement in transportation with roads. Last class, we talked about how internal improvements was not funded. That was a veto by President Madison, where we saw part of Henry Clay's American system did not get passed. So this is being funded by state governments, definitely challenging, but we are seeing improved transportation. We also see this with the steamboat. We also get Robert Fulton and the steamboat, so we can actually move upstream, which definitely allows for better transportation, easier movement of goods. And so Robert Fulton's steamboat is definitely going to help. And then we also have canals. Canals were really a big way to transport goods, where basically goods are put on water on the canals and then moved upstream and down by horsepower, tying them to the horses as the horses move them up and down the canals, and then obviously also using steamboats. So at this point in time, roads, canals, steamboats are the primary uses of transportation, and we're just starting to get into the railroad industry. This is kind of starting to develop in the 1830s, not spread out like we'll get to, but it's starting. Okay. And then we also definitely see immigrants coming in during this market revolution, during this economic growth. We see a major rise in Irish immigrants, German immigrants, and many of these immigrants are going to come to the U.S. and find cheap land out west to start better opportunity. So with moving west, the big reasons, one, the native threat is for the most part has been diminished. 2, lots of economic opportunity. 3, better transportation. And 4, the incoming immigrants are finding new cheap land. So the issue, when the United States starts to expand west, there's going to be some new questions. And with these new questions, looking at this map, as the U.S. is expanding and we're getting more states added into the country, there's definitely going to be new issues that arise. So for one of the big issues economically, one of the new big questions is really about finances. A lot of people prefer to get easy, cheap loans from state banks, and they were actually nicknamed wildcat banks because they really had no regulation. You could easily get a loan, and so a lot of people got land because they got these cheap, easy to get loans from wildcat state banks to get land out west. It avoided going through the Bank of the United States. And we definitely are going to see how these issues are going to lead to some economic tensions, like the Panic of 1819. But one of the biggest questions is definitely the fact that looking at this map, when we have states that are identified as free territories, meaning they do not have slavery, versus states that are identified as slave states because they do have slavery, there is going to be an issue with balance. And so as we see this new issue of moving out west, it seems like there's this nationalism, American pride, expansion, but really it's actually tearing the country apart and causing major division between slave and state and free states. So this ends up directly leading us to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 is really our second big compromise over slavery. The first big compromise over slavery was the 3/5 Compromise in the U.S. Constitution about representation. The Missouri Compromise is going to be about balancing free and slave states. Now, before the Missouri Compromise, there was an equal number of slave and free states. Okay, we had a fair balance. And not only is it a balance of the states, it's really about Congress having a balance of equal number of senators from free and slave states, keeping that balance so that one side doesn't have more power than the other. So when Missouri applied to become a state in 1820, we see this issue arise because there is no other area that has the population to become a free state. Before this, every time a slave state got admitted, a free state got admitted. It kept the balance. But when Missouri applied to become a slave state, there was no other territory that was going to have the ability to become a free state. So this ends up leading to the Missouri Compromise, which was in 1820, and it is primarily going to be led by Henry Clay. Henry Clay is going to be one of those people we talk about for a long time. Henry Clay, who's in the House, he is going to help lead this compromise. Now, before we get to the compromise, there were lots of different opportunities and lots of different solutions thrown out there. One of the more popular ones was called the Tallmadge Amendment. And the Tallmadge Amendment basically said, why don't we admit Missouri as a slave state, but have no more slaves allowed in, and gradually emancipate the people who are slaves. So the Tallmadge Amendment, this idea of no more slaves allowed in and gradually emancipate, definitely threatened the South. Southerners thought, well, if that's going to happen, what's going to happen to us in Georgia? What's going to happen to us in Alabama? And it definitely was seen as a threat. So the Tallmadge Amendment did not happen. It failed miserably because the Southerners saw this as a threat to their slaves. So Henry Clay ends up having to come up with this ability to basically create a compromise. Because the statehood was balanced, because we had equal free and equal slave states, the fact that Missouri is coming in, we have to come up with a compromise. So the compromise actually has three parts. Part one, Missouri will be admitted as a slave state. Missouri will be admitted as a slave state. To keep the balance. Number two, up here in Maine, Maine was part of Massachusetts. So Congress and Henry Clay said, how about we make Maine its own state and it's free? So this kept the balance. Missouri comes in as slave, Maine becomes its own state and is free. But Henry Clay was also thinking about the future. Why not prevent this from ever being an issue again? So they set up what they basically created was a border, the 3630 parallel. And the 3630 parallel will be the border for future slave and free states. So anything north of 3630 will be free. Anything south of 3630 will be slave. And looking at the territory the U.S. had, obviously the North had more, okay? This is all Spanish Mexico, okay? So this compromise with Henry Clay, Missouri comes in as slave, Maine comes in as free, and they set the border for 3630. It doesn't actually resolve the issue, which is slavery. It kind of curbs that issue and puts it off, and we'll definitely see this become an issue again in the near future. But the results, neither the North or the South was really that happy about it, but it did help keep the balance and keep the peace for about 30 years. We are going to see this last and be the border will continue for 30 years until we finally are going to have to compromise again. So what we start to see, though, in the election of 1820, where we are seeing this era of good feelings, right? Obviously, the Republican Party is still dominating. The Republican Party clearly having a huge win. And it's not so much that everyone loved Monroe. It was really the fact that the Federalist Party had died. There was no other party. The Hartford Convention really killed the Federalist Party, and there's really only one clear driving force. However, because of the Panic of 1819 and the Missouri Compromise, we're starting to see that division developing. We're starting to see it coming back. And we will start seeing another party rise up to challenge the other side. So with this, when we think, oh, we look at elections, clearly everyone loved Monroe. That wasn't really the case. It was really just the fact that the Republican Party was pretty much the only party, but the Missouri Compromise and the Panic of 1819 is starting to show that the era of good feelings is not going to last very long. All right. So now we're going to turn our attention to foreign policy. And with foreign policy, we definitely have to talk about Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. With foreign policy after the War of 1812, the United States really feels empowered and kind of sees themselves as a big player in the world to basically have assertive, strong foreign policies. And so with foreign policy after the War of 1812, we are going to see it be driven by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams is John Adams' son. John Adams, y'all remember, helped write the Declaration. He was the vice president, became the second president. Well, John Quincy Adams, like his father, was definitely strong about the national government. He definitely had that federalist mentality to be a strong nationalist. And he wanted to empower the national government and really have this assertive foreign policy that he is going to basically be responsible for. And many historians actually say he was the strongest Secretary of State we've ever had. And obviously that's subject to debate. But with that, he definitely had this opportunity to push the United States into the world, into being a world power. So let's talk about some of the treaties that John Quincy Adams is going to help negotiate and help be responsible for. And a lot of it's going to start off with the border up north in Canada. So the Rush-Bagot Treaty is going to be in 1817. And the Rush-Bagot Treaty, basically what happens is the U.S. and Britain disarm the Great Lakes region. So the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817, the U.S. and Great Britain are going to disarm the Great Lakes region. After the War of 1812, both sides kind of kept camp there. Both sides basically stayed there to keep the illusion that they were strong and that they didn't want the other side to basically invade. However, after this treaty, the U.S. and Great Britain agreed, like, the war's over, the conflict's over, tension's over, let's disarm. So very peaceful border settlement, okay? Then we get the Treaty of 1818. The Treaty of 1818, which was also with Great Britain. So the Treaty of 1818 actually did two things. So one, the Treaty of 1818 established the northern border of Canada, okay, up here, as the 49th parallel. So the Treaty of 1818, we are going to see this whole border, the northern parts of the Louisiana Purchase and Canada, the border will be the 49th parallel. So again, very peaceful negotiations with the border up north. But the second part of the Treaty of 1818 had to do with Oregon. Oregon was claimed by the U.S. and Britain. This is up in like British Columbia, where Vancouver is, right? The British had this area, but the U.S. is also claiming it because we definitely had Americans moving out west. And so basically the Treaty of 1818, Britain and U.S. agreed to share Oregon for 10 years. So Britain and the U.S. will share Oregon for 10 years. Peaceful treaty, okay? We'll talk about when eventually that sharing stops. So with the Rush-Bagot Treaty and the Treaty of 1818, both are with Britain. Both are about the border up north in Canada. Both very peaceful, very successful, okay? The last treaty to talk about is the Adams-Onis Treaty, and I just realized there's a typo there. The Adams-Onis Treaty, which is with Spain. So the Adams-Onis Treaty, going to come back to this map, we have this issue with Florida. Now, Spain still has Florida. Spain has had Florida from day one. When the Spanish explored and came over to the New World, they had this territory. However, in the early 1800s, so many areas in Latin America are having revolutions over Spain, right? We talked about how the American Revolution is going to lead to a wave of revolutions with the French, with Latin America. And so while so many areas like Mexico is having a revolution, all these countries are trying to overthrow Spain, Florida really ends up being kind of abandoned. Spain has to use all of its forces to suppress rebellion, and Florida kind of becomes this like chaotic state that has no structure, has no order. So what starts happening? Well, lots of freed slaves, or actually runaway slaves from Florida. Lots of Native Americans, especially the Seminoles. The Seminoles were really the biggest Native tribe in Florida at this time. And lots of just chaos happening where Seminoles would hop over into Georgia, terrorize Americans, and then go and be free in Florida because it was not American territory. So President Monroe actually asked Andrew Jackson to basically control Florida, get Florida under control. And so when Jackson went to Andrew Jackson, who remember gained his fame from the Battle of New Orleans, when Andrew Jackson went to Florida, not only did he protect the border, he actually invaded Florida. He went into Florida, Spanish Florida, that we have no jurisdiction over. He went in and suppressed the Native Americans. He executed 2 Seminole chiefs, leaders. He basically went in with authority, threatened Native Americans, and we definitely see this being kind of seen as a threat to the sovereignty of the Spanish in Florida. So when this happened, it basically forced the Spanish to sit down and talk to the US, right? This is kind of an act of war. This is definitely seen as a little aggressive on Andrew Jackson's part. But what it ended up leading to is the fact that the Spanish and John Quincy Adams, the US, sat down and talked. And they agreed on a couple terms. 1819, Florida now becomes part of the US. Florida will now be US territory, eventually will become a US state. And in return, America promised to not mess with Spanish Texas. So Florida becomes US territory, and the US promises not to mess with Spanish Texas. Okay, now this is an agreement with Spain. So I know you're thinking, wait, Texas becomes part of the US. That's going to be with Mexico. Okay, this is still Spanish right now. So we will see how those revolutions are going to affect the future of Texas, and especially with the Spanish. So with the Adams-Onis Treaty, with Rush-Bagot and the Treaty of 1818, we're seeing peaceful negotiations and compromises between the U.S. and big powers like Spain and Great Britain. But this then led John Quincy Adams to make one of the strongest claims to U.S. foreign policy, which is the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was initiated in 1823. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823. So as Latin America is having all of these revolutions, these independence movements, these basically creating their own countries, creating their own governments, a lot of countries in Europe, especially Great Britain, saw this as opportunity. These newly independent baby countries could easily be taken over. And so with especially Great Britain eyeing Latin America, eyeing these newly independent countries in Central and South America, the United States feels the obligation to basically threaten or tell the Europeans, you can't come over here. So the Monroe Doctrine basically announced colonization in the Western Hemisphere is closed. The Monroe Doctrine basically announced that colonization in the Western Hemisphere is closed, meaning no Europeans can come into the Western Hemisphere and try and colonize. And you can see this cartoon, Uncle Sam with his hat, the Monroe Doctrine on the Americas, looking over at Europe saying, you are not coming into the West. However, basically with this doctrine, it stated that if Europeans challenge this, America will intervene. So the United States is basically saying that the U.S. is going to protect the entire Western Hemisphere from European colonization. That the U.S. is assuming the responsibility to protect the entire Western Hemisphere. Now, can the U.S. actually do this? Does the U.S. actually have the ability to protect the Western Hemisphere? No way. No way at all. But it's by making that statement, asserting their power. They're trying again, that idea of nationalism is definitely taking place with this type of document. So seeing that nationalism and seeing the Monroe Doctrine trying to stand up to European powers, trying to assert themselves as a world power. Nationalism, without a doubt, is the big effect of the War of 1812. We see it in the economy. We see it with expansion out west. We see it with foreign policy. However, like I said, as the U.S. is asserting itself in the world, as it's expanding and getting bigger, it's actually tearing the country apart as they debate issues over slavery. So next class, we are going to talk more deeply about the economy, the developing economy between the North and the South, and how that is drastically different as well. And we're seeing this nationalism, yet underlying division that's ultimately going to lead us to the Civil War. All right, it's great talking to y'all. Have a good day.